In Sonoma County, it was so hot yesterday, I felt like I was in Tucson, you know. It was kind of great in a way, but slightly immersive and submersive and delirious as our current thing goes. Yeah, very good. So let's, I'll just hit a bell and we'll just sit a bit as people are coming in, which they're still doing. So I think feeling the time is always a good way to come in because the thing about the koans is we're always immersed in some way in the universe. When we feel the time, we stop, I don't know, whatever the ways we prevent ourselves from being immersed. Like, I've said that as my father got older, he got more and more reluctant to be immersed. He didn't really garden much anymore, which is immersive, under the sea thing, and he didn't. And he walked from room to room in his house, and there'd be different media, TV or radio, on different stations as you walk through. But you tell the whole idea is not to go down and swim to the Titanic, not to go underwater. But as he became closer to death, he had no interest in any of that, and he was just really there in life. It was a kind of nice thing how dying can be more living than living is sometimes, Submersion, immersion. There is I guess I said I'm starting anyway. So Tess and I are doing this together, and which is kind of fun. And we're both very interested in, dreams and the ways life is not. We try to make everything concrete and literal, but then we might be interested in the koan world and the dream world. We're interested in, well, what's up here? What's going on? What's up? When we're fascinated with the Titanic, or what's up when I'm gardening? I used to think it was a good thing to get flowers, and I suppose I do. But bring a little beauty into life. Stand up for beauty, When I worked with the people who are straight out of the ghetto, we always try to give them some beauty, But I think I just like being in the garden. It's just like I'm down there, submerged, and the birds flying by my nose, and the plants talking to me, and the sun. So that's what life is. We're in the midst of life, to be in the middle of things. And there's a Japanese koan that goes full fathom 5. That's a Shakespearean koan. I'll do that later. A Japanese koan that goes, in the sea of Issei, the inland sea, 10,000 feet down, there's a single stone. Pick it up without getting your hands wet. And it's a famous koan, and you tell it's about going into your life, going into the immersion. And Tess was talking about, the notion of the Titanic in that way. Our fascination with the Titanic is a fascination about sinking and immersion. And we're trying to make it literal. Let's raise the Titanic again or something like that. That will save us. That will fix global warming. But it's sort of interesting and poignant. And so Tess will talk about that later. But the way the koan works for us today is 12,500 feet down in the midnight zone of the North Atlantic lies a sunken ship. I want to swim through that ship and get its treasure and bring it back. The kind of eerie wonder about sunkenness, that's really about how we stop controlling everything and the universe comes to us. Let's just sit with that for a minute. "12,500 feet down in the midnight zone of the North Atlantic. There's a sunken ship. I want to swim through that ship and bring back its treasure." With a koan, familiar or unfamiliar, you just let it come to you, let it enter your heart, let it enter your mind, and let it surround you, down in the deep. It's still nice to be here. It's grand. Isn't it grand to be in the meditation? Yeah, the vastness, the immersion of it. Well, I think I told you really the headlines of where we're going, and I think I'd like to hand you up for taking it now for a bit, Tess, or you want me to babble on more?
I can take up the babbling if you like.
Babble away.
Hi, everyone. Um, I guess to start, when this topic of the Titanic started coming across the boards, I got very interested and excited because one of the more, as John was saying, we most of the time without realizing it, we live in a mythic landscape. There are sort of great forces or powers in the psyche that as much as we think we're in control of our own minds, I'm sure you've probably realized by now you're not in control of your own body, in control of your own feelings, and that you sort of belong to these archetypal patterns or figures. And so, if you're in love, you get shot by Cupid's arrow, or if you're out in the garden, you might be sniffing the flowers of Aphrodite, or if you're in the lab, you might be, having the objective lens of Apollo or whatever it is. And so it's interesting to start to look at the world that way because it starts to give us, I don't know, a kind of insight into what's living itself through us. And a few years ago, one of the more interesting pieces on this that I came across was something called Resink the Titanic. And it was looking at our obsession with the kind of trying to dredge up the Titanic from this mythic perspective. And it was one of those things when I read it, I just thought, whoa, there's more going on here so much of the time than we realize. And even the way that we, even koans are kind of tiny myths. And like John said, when you really give yourself to it, when you participate and let yourself fall into it fully, it has its own kind of treasure and architecture that will come into your hands if you let go into it. And so, I don't know, I want to tell you a little bit about the myth of the Titanic because it's very easy. It's very easy, and we do want to just look at, like, well, what are the facts of what happened, or what kind of plates were people eating on, or what's gone on with the ship. But history has kind of shown us, each time we try to make a voyage to drag that content up into our day world, into our logical world, it escapes us. There have been times where people have gotten a big piece, and just as they're about to bring it to the surface, the chain breaks and it goes back down to the bottom. Or we know very well this most recent tragedy. But so just to give you a sense that the Titans were a race of gods who sort of predated the Olympians like Zeus and Athena and all the ones we're most familiar with. And they were kind of the pillars of creating the universe. They they came out of chaos, they created time. They were people like Atlas who held up the world, or one who was called Mother of the Wandering Stars, which were the planets. And so they were called the giants of mythology. And if you think about them as inner forces, there's the kind of giantism in our own psyche that has incredible power, but also is prone to get a little full of itself, prone to inflation or grandiosity, or thinking that it isn't really beholden to nature or time, or surely you have glimpsed this part of yourself. I seem to know mine very well, particularly when I'm traveling. I think, no, I can do it. I can do all of it. And what we see mythically is at any time there's this kind of power trip in the psyche. Now you think, or we'll call it the sort of cocaine loving part of the psyche that just thinks, I can do this, that there's always a descent to follow. Anytime we want to ignore the greater laws, there's always a kind of, I don't know, a reckoning, I'll say. And it's not in the way that we hold, every time you might get a little full of yourself, you'll get punished sort of thing. But it's almost like just a larger arc that we just see in life, the Titanic being one of them. And so the Titanic was named after a war, the tenor of the war between the Titans and the Olympians, which was supposedly a great war, and the Olympians won. And the really interesting part of this is that when the Olympians won, they beat the Titans, they shut them into a prison under the sea. Neptune shut them. So already we're like, Titanic now shut it under a prison under the sea. And it's called Tartaros. And what's interesting is that when the Titanic sailed, it was considered the unsinkable ship. And that it was more than just that particular ship. It was representing a time in which the West in particular was feeling like science and progress and the incredible capacities of consciousness could top anything. We had defeated nature. We were on the brink of sort of defeating time and space and any sort of limitations. And this ship kind of came to embody that whole idea of progress. And what's very interesting, and this happens to us too, is that even when the distress cries started to come out, I'll say a little bit more about this, everybody said, but it's an unsinkable ship, it can't happen. And so even warning calls weren't heeded, safety measures weren't paid attention to, because the idea of the Titanic idea that it couldn't be sunk was so powerful. What's interesting about that particular night, and this is a sort of ironic piece, is that one of the ideas around this time was that man was on the brink of resolving, of seeing through all the mysteries, that he was about to crack the code on everything. And what's sort of interesting is the way the fates, which is another mythic force, somehow seemed to conspire in what happened that night. There weren't just, other ships had said there are icebergs, and they thought, well, that doesn't apply to us. We have an unsinkable ship. And there was no moon that night, and so they couldn't see, and there weren't even any waves, and so they didn't get any feedback. And they hadn't ever tested, because this was such a giantess of a ship, they hadn't ever tested its turning capacity or its stopping capacity. Just sort of interesting from a symbolic standpoint too. It had no limits, and yet, or it had its idea of no limits, and yet when all these fates conspired and it started to sink, still no one could believe it was happening. And so in a sense, the argument of this piece that this guy writes is that part of our fascination in returning to it is to try to understand not what happened from a logical standpoint or from a technical standpoint, but that some part of us still can't grapple with what happened. And his argument is because the hubris of that Titanic attitude, and hubris itself being a kind of, I don't know, the part of us that thinks it's, the official definition is something like runs riot over cosmic principles. We don't have, which is a fun way of thinking about it, but sort of like we don't need to heed the laws of nature. We don't need to heed the laws of sleep. We don't need to heed, there's this kind of like, I have a friend, maybe I'll talk about in a bit, but his attitude to life is sort of like none of that applies to him. And so this hubris is something we still, you could see it during the pandemic. You certainly see it in things we're contending with, but you can even see it in meditation, sort of like I shouldn't have to deal with all these dark parts of the material, my sadness or my, or you see it in terms of returning to a particular event, maybe in your life that you want to drag up into the light because you think, if I just understand it better, if I just knew, what diagnosis my mother had, or why my father did this, or why we didn't leave this house, then suddenly I can get free. But it doesn't really work that way. We have to, as John was saying, we have to go down, but not in a literal way. We have to let ourselves be submerged in the feelings of the event and the kind of bath of images that they're offering us. And in this case, there's a particular titan that's at work in this story, and his name is Prometheus. You may have heard of him. He's the one who stole fire from the gods. That's how this whole war, part of how this whole war got started, was he wanted the humans, the Olympians were worried the humans were sort of getting too much power, and Prometheus kind of felt for them. And so during a sacred ritual that was meant to kind of balance the forces between the divine and the humans, he steals the fire and gets in a lot of trouble. And he gives it to the humans, which for us has meant consciousness and innovation and creativity and all those kind of sparking parts of our own mind. But for his transgression, he was punished and he was tied to a rock. And every day a bird would come and eat his liver. And every night the liver would grow back. And so this would happen every day. And one of the interesting things about it is that's what's missing when Prometheus gets sort of out of control. The Promethean part of us gets out of control, which thinks it's above the gods or above the laws of the cosmos, is that notion of sacrifice, or to make sacred, to honor the forces of beauty or of love or of limits. And when we forget to honor them, or we blatantly kind of push them aside, it tends to be that we're the ones who are sacrificed, or the sacrifice is chosen for us. And what this article argues is that that's part of what happened with this wreck, is that it was impossible for it to. What's interesting is there was a sister ship almost exactly identical to the Titanic called the Olympus, and it sailed through just fine. And so what keeps drawing us back to understand this, I guess, is a question, and not in a literal way, but to see, well, what happened? And what the myth also tells us, in a sense, is, well, what's needed when this happens, when Prometheus gets a little bit out of control? And we might, his friend I mentioned, his newest interest is flying cars. You think, well, what could possibly go wrong? And you can tell this Promethean part of the psyche, it's just always wanting to like game things and get ahead of things. But when that part of us transgresses or gets ahead of itself, it does get bound somehow to some kind of suffering, and it has to be humbled in the face of. And in a sense, this is part of what happens when you have a practice, is that you go into this thing thinking like, I will just, raise myself above all of these dark forces of the psyche, all the things that would require going down. I will just be enlightened, and then I will not have to worry about them. And instead, what happens is there is this kind of binding quality that you make of yourself a chain, that every day you return to your practice, and you might be submerged in material or in parts of your mind that are quite difficult to navigate, or you might feel like you're being punished by sitting there. I've certainly heard that from people, why do I do this to myself? Particularly during like day 2 or 3 of session, I'm going home. This was another terrible idea. But that part of what happens in that binding, or in that sort of making sacred again, because after this, Prometheus sort of offers himself to Zeus as a companion and as a servant, is that all our titanic qualities, parts of us that are prone to excess and transgression and staying on the surface of things, are worked over and tempered and softened and transformed. And there comes a certain point when we become free again, and then we become of service to the other gods and sort of a companion to them, instead of trying to outsmart them all the time. And I guess the other, maybe one of the last interesting things about this, is that, as I mentioned, even the sinking of this particular ship didn't disrupt the certainty that was at play. And in a way, to make sacrifice is to be in awe and to remain uncertain of life itself, which is what we're cultivating in koan practice, in a sense, that we're not pretending to get control of things. There's so many koans about, it's better to have nothing than something good, or step by step in the dark, or like we're learning in some way to honor the dark and to turn toward it and not outsmart it. And in that way, I don't know, the gods, those great forces can come to visit us and live through us, but they don't tend to be quite as hard on us if we're not trying to outsmart them. And so the last thing I'll talk about, how are we doing on time? Perfect. And then maybe we'll sit, is a guy who wrote this article. His name is Glenn Slater. And one of these things he talks about would be that to become submerged, to look deeper into our own lives, then we don't need to literalize everything quite so much. We don't have to have the hull of the Titanic brought up into a museum. We actually tend to the part of us that might feel the immense grief at the loss, or the bafflement, or try to understand more deeply what happened in terms of these mythic forces, rather than, if they had been going 85 knots instead of whatever, then maybe it wouldn't have happened. You can see, like, I don't know, I have those parts of my mind that want to argue with things instead of really looking at what was unfolding. That maybe I didn't want to see. No, I didn't want to see that maybe I was sad, or I didn't want to feel a certain loss. The friend I mentioned, the flying cars friend, a few years ago, because he's definitely someone who he likes to move fast, and he's incredibly bright and very handsome, and he's always sort of I don't know, he's got his life pretty rigged, except for that a few years ago, his wife having their second child, the baby was stillborn, and it was an unimaginable tragedy for them. And he was sharing with me recently how even in the face of that, all he could do, the Titanic part of him, just became obsessed with information. How did it happen? How do we prevent it from happening? How can we stop it in other women? How do we ensure if there's another baby that this won't? And he kept sort of pushing ahead, and he wanted his wife to have another baby. And, he wanted, you could tell there was just an immense pull to get through the difficulty instead of actually feel it. And one of the consequences that's had is that now when his little one has a happy event, he and his wife often just end up crying. And people think they're crying because they're happy, but they can't help but imagine the child that was lost. And so it's like that, being drawn back to that scene, something's asking to be felt and held and digested before we move on so quickly. And he's starting to realize this, that he's not going to sort of escape the depth of what happened and in a way, the sacrifice that was made in his otherwise really beautiful, blessed life. And he was saying to me that he can still, sometimes he feels that baby in his arms. Sometimes he can just feel holding it. And it's like in that is that kind of bound quality of just having your liver picked out every day and then being able to have it regenerated at night, but that coming down into your life so that things can actually move. And so the thing Slater says about this, what is the right action? What do you do when the ship goes down? Now, what do you do when you encounter things you can't get around? Take to the lifeboats, but there's no other shore. Check in with your analyst. Go down like Lord Jim with honor and courage and decency, have an idea. At least keep things ship shape. Or he says, perhaps perform the rituals of sinking. Like to really have the sinking, whatever that is in life. Which might mean also to really have the flowers in the garden, or to really have the smoke I've had in my backyard because of the fires in Canada. To not escape into trying to jump over it, but to really have that immersion, to perform the rituals of being in my own life, in a sense. And I think that's what meditation is. It's performing the ritual of immersion. So maybe let's do some of that. But John, would you like to say anything more about this territory before we sit?
Yeah, the immersion is everywhere, I think. I mean, I was thinking about, whenever I've gotten sick, I'm sinking, and instead of like fighting, I mean, I think it's important to take the drugs or whatever you need to take, the acupuncture or whatever. But when I do that, but there's something nice about, oh, what if I'm submerged and immersed, and then my mind actually gets freer, and it's a nice thing, I told the leader we have teachers meetings intermittently in Pacific Zen, and I made during the last session, somebody asked me how I was feeling. A couple of people asked me how I was feeling, and I said, "Oh, I'm fine. I'm just about to go in and teach." And they just looked at me and didn't say anything. I thought, "Oh, maybe I should check how I am." And I was just a bit sad about it. It wasn't a big deal, but it was like, if it had been a big deal, that would have been okay too. And it was so nice and rich to feel that I was to sink a little bit like that, and I felt like so much more connected to. There was Tess and Alison were the two people who. How are you? I think I thought I should ask why they're asking. And there's nothing wrong with. There are times when it's good to, I don't care how I'm feeling. Here we are. Other times when we let in the scope of the universe, that the illness itself is a path, or things like that, or the whatever it is that's hard, the bankruptcy, the divorce, whatever. It's a kind of sinking. And looking at this, I looked at the notion that the Titanic itself was a kind of offering. People thought it was a triumphal parade, really. The word triumph comes from Roman times, really, and parading, saying we have now conquered Gaul and committed mass murder upon its inhabitants. Isn't that great? And that sort of thing. And so a triumphal parade. Instead of that, it was some sort of connection to the depths and the limits of life, and how life can actually offer us things. And I was thinking about the ship as a sort of offering on an altar, but it's restless and it keeps drawing people to it. It's like it would have been considered a possessed demon once. The ship is now a demon, keeps drawing people to it and destroying them and things. Very good. That's what it's supposed to do. So I like the metaphor of being lost is another kind of way of thinking. The being lost is something always to value, and I personally think that being lost is always the beginning of a deep practice. And then you make the sacrifices, like sacrifice some time and sit still for a while, sacrifice my busy mind for a while, things like that. Put them on the altar. Very good. Do you want to lead the meditation? What do you want?
Sure.
Very good. Go for it.
The thing you were just making me think of is how so often, like that ship up on the thing, the things it was saying, that having just a proper funeral rites for things, instead of keep wishing they were different, to honor reality as it is. Yeah, let's sit. So whatever it is for you, you might have a tendency to push past or skip over. You're here now. At the edge of the sea, in the Sea of Issei, 10,000 feet down, lies a single stone. I want to pick up that stone without getting my hands wet, which means somehow whatever needs retrieving, it's just for you. You're finding your way down already.
Very good. There's an enduring power to stories about what happens under the sea, like The Little Mermaid, and how you get transformed as a place of initiation. There's a great Irish legend which we've worked with sometimes with our leadership and other people, called Con Edda, where in order to be initiated really, but also save himself from his wicked stepmother and all those the usual things, the usual problems, and his own naivete, he has to go down to the land of the Fyrbolgs, who are the underwater fairies, and make terrible sacrifices, including the thing that he loves most. And so that sort of thing happens under the sea. And then he realized, and of course, when the sacrifice is made, everything transforms and becomes stars. A bit like in Beauty and the Beast, where she realizes she loves the beast and he's dying, and she kisses him, and then suddenly the night is full of shooting stars, and he becomes a beautiful prince. So it's like that sort of thing always happens underwater, so, in some way. And here's Shakespeare's version. Where should this music be, i' the air or the earth? It sounds no more, and sure it waits upon some god of the island. Sitting on a bank, weeping again the king, my father's wreck. This music crept by me on the waters, allaying both their fury and my passion. Allaying both their fury and my passion, settling the storm down, but also my grief. The music does, with its allaying both their fury and my passion with its sweet air. Thence I have followed it, or it hath drawn me rather, but 'tis gone. No, it begins again. Ariel sings. Ariel's the fairy. Full fathom 5 thy father lies, of his bones are coral made. Those are pearls that were his eyes, nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. Shakespeare's putting the transformation in the middle of it too. Those are pearls that were his eyes. And there's another great poet. Milton was the great poet who came after Shakespeare. And his friend at university died at sea in a shipwreck, and he did a few ideological things with the grief, but hoped that he went to the Protestant, not the Catholic side of things like that. But here's a beautiful, just a portion of Lycidas is the poem, and it's a great lyric. He tries to overcome his grief by beautiful language, really, and so let that be a lesson to you. So, while thee the shores and sounding seas wash far away, where'er thy bones are hurled, whether beyond the stormy Hebrides, whether thou perhaps under the whelming tide visits the bottom of the monstrous world, or whether thou to our moist vows denied sleeps by the fable of Bellerus old, where the great vision of the guarded mount looks towards Namancos and Biona's hold. That's his little propaganda thing. Maybe you're looking towards Catholicism now that you're dead, or something, because there's a big war going on. Whereas, but the whole thing about beyond the stormy Hebrides, where thou perhaps under the whelming tide visits the bottom of the monstrous world, meaning full of monsters, and there's something kind of, he's trying to deal with his loss and his grief of his friend. Look homeward, angel, now, and melt with ruth. Pity, empathy, love. The name actually means that. Look homeward now, angel, now, and melt with ruth. And O ye dolphins, waft the hapless youth. So, carried away by dolphins, and so the angel looking homeward and melting with ruth. Emily Dickinson has a shipwreck poem, but it's kind of boring, so I won't read it. But I just wanted to mention that it's kind of, well, I'll read it, it's a kind of tease. You can tell she can't get down. In this poem, she can't get down. Shipwreck, it tossed and tossed, a little brig I knew. Overtook by blast, it spun and groped delirious for morn. It slipped and slipped as one that drunken stepped. Maybe it's not so bad, the poem. It slipped and slipped as one that drunken stepped. Its white foot tripped, then dropped from sight. Ah, brig, good night. To you, to crew and you. Ah, brig, good night to crew and you. The ocean's heart too smooth, too blue to break for you. So that's Emily, who does it all by kind of genius, just sheer genius, basically. and anyway, the Thomas Hardy has a great thing about the wreck of the Titanic, and he sees that he brings in the fate aspect. So some people at the time didn't see it as like tragedy, but just fate, you know. And as the smart ship grew, and like he says, while the ship was being made, an iceberg was being made, and they were destined, but nobody knew it. They were destined to meet, to have a deep encounter. As the smart ship grew in stature, grace, and hue, in shadowy silent distance grew the iceberg too. Alien they seemed to be, no mortal eye could see the intimate welding of their later history, or sign that they were bent by paths coincident on being anon twin halves of one august event, till the spinner of the years said now, and each one hears, and consummation comes and jars two hemispheres. So, yeah. I'm not going to read it now because it's long, but there's a wonderful poem by Adrian Rich called Diving into the Wreck that's really about diving into the psyche, into the deep psyche. And maybe one day, maybe we'll read it on another show, but I want to hear more things from Tess too, and I want to read one more poem. I'm not sure, somebody sent, maybe my friend Nicola, who lives in Edinburgh, might have sent this to me, but somebody, I'm great, whoever sent this to me, thank you, whoever it was. And there was a whole bunch of Irish monks who were sort of half pagan and half Catholic, and they lived right in the westernmost part of Ireland, out in the Atlantic, and of Scotland. And you can tell they were just completely immersed in the universe. That was their way of being immersed, to live this very reclusive, quiet life. It's called the Western Isles, and there's some I don't know when it was written, and the way it came to me, I don't even know who wrote it. But I'm going to read it because it's great. My tidings for you, it's a letter to a friend. My tidings for you, the stag bellows, winter snows, summer has gone. Wind high and cold, the sea short his course, sea running high. Deep red the bracken, its shape all gone. The wild goose has raised his wonted cry. And by contrast, a summer one, here's another one, a summer one. The smooth sea flows, season when the ocean falls asleep, flowers cover the world. The smooth sea flows, season when the ocean falls asleep, flowers cover the world. Yeah, so there we go. This is the last poem I'm going to read, perhaps, probably. Poems and opinions come free. This is Ikkyu, the great, mad, wild genius of Zen. You do this, you do that, you argue left, you argue right, you come down, you go up. This person says no, you say yes. Back and forth, you are happy. You are really happy. This is a great Zen thing. This is about immersion too. This is great Yuan Wu, who composed the Blue Cliff record in Sichuan. When you enter into enlightenment right where you are, you penetrate to the profoundest source. You cultivate this realization till you attain freedom of mind, harboring nothing in your heart. Here there is no understanding to be found, much less not understanding. This is the realm of no mind, no contrived activity, no concerns. How could this be judged with mere worldly intelligence and knowledge and discrimination and learning? It's complete immersion. So yeah, what are you going to do, Tess? Do you want to say anything? Do you want to just launch into another meditation? Meditation's always good, I think.
I'll
What do
say
you
just a couple things.
want?
I'll say just a couple things, then we can meditate. Yeah. Um, One is that quality of what that Ikkyu poem you just read made me think of a Monty Python skit I ran across not so long ago where you could pay someone to have an argument. And it was clear that like winning was not the point. This guy just kept wanting to pay so he could keep arguing, and then you could argue about anything. And finally he said, well, you haven't paid me enough. Well, yes, I have. No, I haven't. Yes, I have. Now stop that, but just so that you can be immersed in it, like anything to whatever it is to feel alive. And I was just thinking, both as Jordan was playing, but I thought, well, what is that? Like, what's that quality of really being immersed in my own life? And noticing being here, I've been home a lot the last little while, and I've learned that if I drive really slowly when I'm leaving, I can catch the little activity on the driveway as I go down. And the other day, I was coming down, and there was a little family of 3 little baby skunks with their mother that had just come out of their den, and they were all kind of, and if I could just stop the car and go very, very slowly, then they all kind of, engaged. And it's being immersed. I can feel when things might be around, or when encounters might be possible, or what the weather's doing, or it's like all this kind of being drenched and met by all these different aspects of my life, sort of like being drenched in all of Jordan's music. And like that last poem you read, you think, I don't need to understand what's happening. I can just let it happen on me now. So that's it. You can lead the I miss
Okay.
you, Bella.
I thought maybe we might bring a couple of people in. Is that okay? How do you feel about that? Let's start with Alison, who's very into immersion in her own way. No, I'm not. Yes, yes, you are. No.
That's very funny. Well, I was thinking about the Titanic and the passion with which the mind wants to establish irrefutable causal links, and how that kind of activity of finding why something happened and who was at fault, or who gets the accolades even, it doesn't matter, but establishing these irrefutable causal links, that activity of the mind is the very thing that is holding off the immersion in the moment. And I was just with my mother last week, who turned 95 on Monday. And at the same time, she decided to die. She hasn't died yet, but she was very close and sort of sinking down and then rising up back into life and sinking down. And then during that time, various family members were coming and going. And I noticed this strange thing where when that there was something about being with my mother and her state of, there was no causal links being made. She was not doing any of that. She was simply with me in the way a baby is with you and gazes directly at you, with like the universe appearing, and you can almost see the stars swirling. And there's none of that activity of the self, which is establishing some sort of causal link. And the tremendous intimacy of that. And then at one point, one of my brothers walks into my mother's room with my sister-in-law, who I have not spoken to either of them in several years. And my mind over many years has been all about establishing causal links. And then when they walked in, none of that was there. And it was almost like the intimacy was so strange and I would say beautiful. And that for the first time, I just looked at their faces with this, and I just had no idea who these people were. And not that I didn't remember our history or any of that, but there was I wasn't defending myself from the encounter with the causal links. And so I guess that's all I have to say.
Very good. Immersed beyond causal. That's a true thing about dying, isn't it? That people, like whales, they go down, then sometimes they come back for a bit, and then odd Shane Stokes breathing and things like that, where you don't breathe, and then you pant, and you don't breathe, and then next day you're as good as ever. So, who knows? Tess suggested George Foy would be an interesting person who knows a lot about the sea and is a wonderful writer. And so, I don't know if Tess, did you want to prompt George or?
But if you have a location on him, you can.
I just asked him to unmute, I think.
Then let's have it, George.
Thanks to me. The book I wrote or had published last was about a shipwreck. It was about a huge ship, 50,000 tons, that was 33 crew that was lost in a hurricane off the Bahamas. And I went into this having been a ship's officer at one point, thinking I'm uniquely qualified to understand what happened, because nobody really knew. In fact, the ship disappeared for some time before anybody knew she was sunk, despite all this satellite navigation and radio and so forth, communications that they had. And so I went in just determined to analyze everything from the stress factors in metal to the captain's psychology. And the more I dove into this wreck in terms of research, the finer the grain of what I had to understand was. The captain was suffering various kinds of stress, nervousness about his job if he didn't get to Puerto Rico on time. Also, real hubris in how he considered himself vulnerable to some of these forces because of the accuracy of the satellite navigation and his ability to find his way in the midst of a Category 3 storm. And the psychology too of some of his mates, one of whom, a woman named Danielle Randolph, accepted long before anybody else understood what was going to happen, that the ship was going to go down and nobody would survive. And she, in fact, sent an email to her mother. They still had satellite email, saying essentially goodbye and I love you all, which was very, very uncharacteristic of her. What I'm trying to get across is that the more and more I understood the complexity, the more I became awed by what had happened to the ship, these forces. The ship went down like the Titanic in almost 2 miles of water and was found later. But what arose in me was eventually, as I said, an awe and also kind of a love for all this immense complexity that is completely not understandable, no matter how qualified you are, no matter how deep you dive or how into what kind of detail you go. And to sum up, or to bring up another incident much closer, in fact, a few days ago, I was about 30 miles offshore on a boat, and the wind was coming up, and I was trying to shorten the Genoa, which is a triangular sail in the bow of the boat. And I let go of the lines that held the sail a little bit too early, and the sail started wrapping itself around the forestay, the part that holds it up, and which could be a real problem if the wind really came up. And so I finally figured out the only way to unwind it, I couldn't do it by hand, it was too big, was to turned the boat in circles, which I had to do about 3 or 4 times before the sail finally came out. And I was thinking, this was in thick fog, by the way, and I was thinking, thank God nobody can see me. And just at that point, there was a beep from my fancy satellite warning system saying there was a ship right nearby on the collision course with me. And I looked up, and sure enough, through the fog, there was a big research vessel called the Nicobar bearing down very close to me at least. And I radioed the ship and said, "Do you see me?" Kind of hoping they hadn't, but they radioed back saying, "It's okay, we're gonna change course." But all that to say that here too, the things that can go wrong, the immense complexity and fine detail of the forces at play when you're offshore in a ship are something that are terrifying, something that is terrifying, but also that you end up loving, and also you have to laugh at. I mean, again, the feeling of going around in circles, thinking I was completely unseen, and yet there were probably 20 people on that ship saying, "What the hell is this idiot doing?" Contradicting a bit to the feeling I always get when I get offshore, which is I've tried to do everything right and get everything nailed down so that I'm not going to die out here. But once I'm out of sight of land, there's a curious acceptance that happens. There's nothing more you can do. You have to just deal with it and laugh at it if you can. I think that's about it. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
George.
George. That's wonderful. Okay. Meditation in the depths. Actually, I like the idea of spinning around. Like, it's a kind of known that happened to me once. It's a known, and I'm of course much more likely to happen to than to George, but it's a wonderful thing. Can't get your sail depowered. So yeah, it's all those ways the universe is bigger than us. In the sea. Here, right here in the sea. 12,500 feet down in the midnight zone of the North Atlantic. Lies a sunken ship. I want to swim down and bring back a treasure. In the sea, far down in the midnight zone, there's a sunken ship. I want to swim down and get the treasure there. In the sea, far, far down. So, it's come to 4 vowels. Thank you for the music, Mike. I was sort of like listening to Ariel. What else to say, Tess? Jordan's going to do the 4 vowels, and you are happy. You're really happy.
No, thanks everyone. It's
Thank
nice
you.
to just swim around together.
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Tess. And thank you for coming. We just love being in this together. It's for a long time we've been saying awakening is something that we do together. So it happens together. So thank you. Thank you, everyone else.
Thank you, John. Thank everyone.